It's good to be here this morning. Sometimes in our lives, something comes up where we see something and that causes us to get to thinking. And as preachers, it's a fortunate thing because when we see something that catches our eye, we can start digging into it, and then we can say, okay, well, I'm gonna turn that into a lesson. I'm gonna make that useful. And last week we had looked at the song "I Am Resolved," and one of the statements in there was, "I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delights." And so I got to thinking about that idea of people that had lingered, and I had mentioned a couple of those ideas in our lesson last week. And it was interesting, I got to looking and I found the phrase or the simple statement that Lot lingered. And I thought, that's really interesting. I'd never really thought of that. When I think of lingering and I think of the account of the life of Lot, I think of Lot's wife, right? And even Jesus himself reminds us or tells us to remember Lot's life, that she had looked back and what had happened because she lingered, or she was, the idea is, hesitant, or staying in a place longer than they should be. She was hesitant. She turned what she was fleeing from, and she found herself, she found the destruction that she found in her physical body for that. And so I got to thinking, well, that's interesting. We've never really focused on, or I hadn't focused on, Lot himself. And so we're going to just do a very brief walk through some of the major events in the life of Lot. And this doesn't cover all of them. And there's a major event that occurs at the end of what I'm going to talk about, but we're not going to get into that. But I thought it would be valuable to spend some time just learning from one of the people that God has provided us to learn from in his word. And I put on here the idea of a look at the life of the nephew of Abram. Because one of the first things that we end up noticing is his relationship to Abram. And I want to tell you in our lesson, while some of that may be important. In Genesis, the 11th chapter, in verse 27, it says, "This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot." And so we see the three brothers that were born, and then one of those three brothers has a son, which would make Abram the uncle to that son. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, it says, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan." And so one might ask, well, why is it important? Why bring up the fact that Lot is the nephew of Abram? Well, it has to do with the idea of, we see that in his life, Lot had very positive, influential people around him, right? Lot had a very influential uncle who was there, and Lot spent a great time around Abram, who, as we know, is later named Abraham. And we know all of the blessings that come through the actions of Abraham. And so he starts out in a very good place, we would say, right? He starts out where he's around positive influences. And so one would think that those influences that we have around us are going to impact how we live. So I thought it's important to note that he starts out with a very, very positive background. And there are those of us in the church, how does it relate to us today? There are those of us in the church who are fortunate enough to have grown up around the positive influence or had, close influence. Maybe not a father, maybe it was an uncle, maybe it was somebody, but had the opportunity to observe someone who is faithful and someone who can leave an impact. And so not only considering Lot, but considering maybe I'm not the Lot in that situation, but maybe I need to be the Abram for the Lot in that situation, that maybe there's not a father in place to be an influential figure, right? And so maybe I need to help fulfill that role because, again, positive influence, most of the time, positive influence will lead to positive results and positive choices. So we see where he begins, and then we come to the first problem that we find that exists in the relationship really that exists in Lot's life. And it's not so much as you look at it a problem between Abram and Lot, so much as it is between their herdsmen or their people. But let's look at the account. It says in Genesis chapter 13, beginning at verse 5, once again, Lot also went with Abram, and he had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And so there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. And so we have now a situation that comes up where both of these men are blessed, right? I mean, we can tell they have livestock, they have these things, that they have these possessions that they have that are so great that it's making it difficult, or next to impossible, we would say, making it difficult for them to remain in the same place. And so what that's going to mean is that, as we've seen in the past, Lot has been able to go with Abram. Now we're going to see a slight separation between the two, right? Now we're going to see a time where that influence isn't always going to be there anymore. That Lot now has to go out and stand on his own and make his own decisions, right? He's had the right environment, he's had the right teaching growing up, but at some point, he has to separate from that positive influence. Again, does that happen in our lives? Are there points at which we as children, as we grow older, have to make decisions where we may part from, those positive influences that we've had in the past, and we hope that we will carry those things with us. So we have this situation now where there's not enough space, and then we have what I termed the offer. And this is what takes place. So there's this recognition, and Abram, being the older and really the one who should be respected, right, and the one who should be the one to make the choice because he is the elder and he has been the one that is there. But Abram says to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? He says, please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. So look at it. We have a situation here where really the one who should get to make the decision of where they're going to be, the one who has been the leader, is giving Lot the opportunity to make a choice, right? This is a truly positive or a wonderful gesture, I believe, on the part of Abram, saying, you go ahead, we can't be together, and because we have to separate, I'll let you choose what you feel is going to be best for you. And so what happens is Lot simply looks. Lot doesn't consider Abram at all, I don't believe, in his decision. What do we see Lot do? So the offer is made, and immediately in verse 10 we read, so Lot lifted his eyes, and he saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. So then Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. So here's the offer. Lot doesn't do what I think some of us might have thought we would want to do. Say, oh, well, no, you're the older, you've been, a mentor or whatever. You should get to make the choice. I don't see where he even considers what might be available to Abram. He just looks at with his eyes what looks like the best way to go, doesn't he? He sees that this is the best way to go, and without any conversation, he just says, I'll take what's the best for me. Right? I'll take what's the best for me. There was no consideration. There was no talk about maybe other options that could have taken place. Just kind of a quick action, really, of I'll take this particular thing. And when we consider what can happen, we need to consider that a lot of sin starts simply with a look, right? It begins with a look. And within that look then it creates a desire, and then that desire ultimately leads toward action. And so considering this idea of look, we see in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6 what happened to the woman Eve when she chose to just look, right? The consideration was all about, what do I see in front of me? It says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. She knew that she wasn't supposed to do that, right? She knew that's not what God wanted, but when she looked upon it with her eyes, and I would say she lingered, because I believe the devil causes her to linger and continue to look. He continues to point it out to her, all the benefits that she could get of something she's not supposed to have. And so she lingers long here. As a side note, she lingers long and pays attention, and she decides, well, because it looks good to me, I'm going to go ahead and take it based on its looks and not necessarily what I know to be true. I think, and I see these things like, she saw the tree was good for food. I think Lot saw that the land was good for food. Lot saw that this was a place where he could go and he could be successful. Plenty of food for him, for his herdsmen and people and things like that. He saw that those things were good. It was a desirable place to go, so he just, instead of considering really anyone else, he considered himself. And he said, I'm going to take what's best for me, just as we see that Eve has done here. In James chapter 1, verse 14 and 15, we have the warning. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away or by his own desires and is enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So we have to be real careful where we look, right? And we have to be real careful to stop and think, just because something looks like it may be a good thing for us does not necessarily make it so, right? That we have to get beyond that, even to the extent that if we look at something and it's not good to us and it causes us to sin, Christ gives an example in his teachings of, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If you pluck it out, you can't linger on what it is that you were looking at because you can't see it anymore. But put that out of your sight if it's something that is causing a desire in you for something that may not be beneficial. And I'm not saying specifically that the land was a bad thing. What I am going to say is it's going to lead into some difficulties because he doesn't consider everything around him. He's so locked in and focused on the land and what it looks like that he's not focused on what's around, right? He kind of gets lost in his thinking. So what happens is we find Lot's location. So he's got this look. It says, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. So one thing that tells me is not only did he separate, but he went quite a ways, right? I don't know if I've ever heard that pointed out to people, but it just kind of dawned on me, even just looking at it, that it says, even as far as. So he didn't just go away enough to create the separation that was needed for the herdsmen and the people to be okay, but still have maybe closeness to Abram and that positive influence. But he went as far as Sodom. And what he didn't pay attention to, verse 13, but the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. What he saw was, this is good, desirable land for what I want. This is good and desirable for me. What he missed was, this is not a good place to want to look upon. This is not a place of good people. This is not going to be a place of positive influence as you've had in the past. And again, how can we relate this to our own lives? When you start thinking about going away, when you start thinking about leaving your family as you grow and you leave, and I think a lot about this because I have a son that's entering that stage. But as you think about going away, you need to think about it. This might look like exactly the school that you want to go to. It's exactly where you want to, it's got what you want, the classes you want, it's where you want to be. But there might not be a church anywhere near that location, right? But you're so focused on this is what's going to be good for me that you miss some of the things that won't offer that positive influence, right? And recognize that the further you get from your family, the further you are from their influence. The further you get away from people who are part of the Lord's church, if you don't have a congregation in that area, the further you put yourself from positive influence. And so it leads to other things. So we have his location. And then it's interesting what happens in his life is at some point he gets wrapped up and caught up in the middle of a battle. And he ends up getting taken captive. He's pitched his tent towards Sodom. Everything's been fine over where Abram's at, right? We don't hear of any problems going on where Abram's at. But Lot gets caught up in a battle. In verse 11 of chapter 14, it says, "Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. And they also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." So all this good and how great things he thought were going to be, he somehow gets caught up in this battle, and he's eventually taken captive, and so he loses his freedom, and all of his goods are taken from him as well. Right? Not such a good situation as compared to where he first starts out. And I'll come back to why I find that to be important as we look at his life overall. Jumping to verses 14 through 16 of chapter 12, we find Lot's rescue. And isn't it interesting? Look who it is that comes to Lot's rescue. Verse 14 says, "When Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan." And these phrases, "as far as," means they're traveling distance, right? I'm going a long way to make this happen. "And he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people." And so, who is it that comes to Lot's rescue? The very person that he had not considered in taking the land. The very person that he didn't take the time and say, "Hey, maybe we can work together. Maybe we can do something so that we're both beneficial." Didn't talk it out. But when Abram finds out that he's in trouble, it's immediate. The first thing he does is he says, "Where is he?" And I'm going to go get him back. And so now we're in a good situation again, right? Because now he's back around that positive influence. And that's why I want to go back to, I think it's important, this idea of his slavery. Because he's now given a second opportunity, right? He's given an opportunity to make a decision on where he's going to dwell and where he's going to stay once again. He's been taken out of the city of Sodom. And so we learn of in what I'll call, in Genesis 19, verses 1 through 3, I'll call it Lot's relocation. Right? Lot's relocation. And what does he choose to do? Beginning in verse 19, it says, "Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground." Here he is, right back in the place where the people are exceedingly wicked. He was relieved of that, wasn't he? He had an opportunity after having been pulled away from that area. But there must have been something in his mind's eye that thought that was a good place to be, right? There had to be a reason he would want to go back where he was before. And so again, he's still focused on this idea of this is a place where there's good land. This is a place where I can be successful. So he goes back, and now we see him even sitting at the gate of the city. And as the angels come, he says, "Here now, my Lord, please turn to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, and then you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly. So they turned to him and entered his house, and he made him a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Again, just little things that sometimes pop into my mind, and maybe things that will pop into your mind as you look. We started out with he pitched his tent toward Sodom, right? He had when we think of a tent, we think of a temporary dwelling, don't we? Your tent is a place where you're living temporarily. He has now made the choice to move to Sodom, where he's been looking and what he's been looking at, and he's now got a house, from what I can see, right? He's now said, "This is where I'm going to make my dwelling." And in his eyes, what he sees, again, what we're told he sees is the good of all of it. But what we're told the Lord sees is that there were many wicked people that dwelled there. So we have this situation where we have this relocation, and then we go into this, and this is one of those areas that I'm not going to go into and talk about greatly, but we have the situation where we do see him doing what's right initially and inviting guests into his home, right? That we're taught. I mean, this is a perfect example of what's talked about of be sure to welcome strangers into your own home. In doing so, you may have welcomed angels unaware, right? This is that concept. So he's done what was right, and a lot of people get caught up in his actions. But the bottom line of what he was trying to do was he was trying to do what the law expected him to do. He was trying to protect those that were in his household, right? They became his responsibility when they entered his home. So put aside how he tried to do it and all of that, and just recognize that there is an attempt here by Lot to be doing the right thing. He's trying to be a godly man. So he's made mistakes, but that doesn't mean he doesn't try to be a godly man, right? And I think that's important as well. So we move forward a little bit in chapter 19, and Lot receives a warning. And this warning is coming from the two angels, the two men that have been sent there. Beginning at verse 12, it says, "Then the men said to Lot, 'Have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it.'" Now look at what it says. "So Lot went out and spoke to his son-in-laws who had married his daughters." Stop right there, because there's something important there, right? Lot has now allowed his daughters to marry from the land of people that are exceedingly wicked, right? Probably not doing a good job of keeping the right type of people and the right type of example around his daughters. But he makes the decision and allows his daughters to marry. Continuing on in verse 14, he said, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But his son-in-laws thought he seemed to be joking, right? So he goes and he tells them that he's received this message that they need to get out of the city, they need to do it immediately. And his son-in-laws are like, "Dad must be crazy," or "Dad must be just kidding," right? He must be joking. They didn't take him serious. And it's probably because, and again, here's some speculation. So this is set aside, this is some speculation, but if the city is exceedingly wicked and there is a lot going on, there's not a whole lot of respect for who God is and what he may say in the first place, right? So most likely they weren't inclined probably to know a whole lot about who the true God was and his way of thinking. Verses 15 through 17 is where we get to the phrase that I said caused me to start this whole study, and that is Lot lingered. It says, "When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, 'Arise, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city.'" Arise, hurry, because if you don't, you're going to perish right along with everybody else. And God is merciful, right? God has decided, despite the mistakes that Lot has made, right? Despite his mistakes, despite pitching his tent among the wicked people, God is still going to show mercy upon Lot. And so he's telling them, and it says, "And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city." Now stop and think about that. You've got two men, two angels, and there's just enough hands really to cover Lot's wife, and his two daughters. And so what we see is, because Lot is hesitant, that's what it means to linger. Because he's hesitating and not reacting quickly, and the angels have said, "Hurry, move quickly," they actually take him by the arm along with his family, and they bring them out. That's God's mercy. God's saying, I'm gonna save this soul because I've made this choice. It says, so it came to pass when they brought them outside that he said, escape for your life. Do not look behind, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. So again, how close does God want you to be to the sin? Right? Could he have just gotten outside the city and been free of the fire that rained down from the heavens? Yeah. But he says, don't stop, right? Don't wait in the plains. You know, you made the mistake the first time of staying too close to where sin was. Maybe you weren't a part of it at that time, but you were too close to it the first time. Get as far away from it as I tell you to. Go into the mountains. In the mountains, you're not going to see what's taking place. And he says, and don't even look back. You ever wonder why? Wonder why the command is to not look back? It's because his heart was set on what was there initially, right? And so what happens if we look back sometimes? We move or we shift where our heart's desire is again, don't we? Or we start thinking more positive about things and we don't see them the way they really are. People get nostalgic sometimes when they look back. And nostalgia can be a wonderful thing, but a lot of times it can be it's not really the way that you thought it was. You have this idea that it's better than it really is. But don't look back. Don't be distracted by that sin because it can catch your eye. But if your eye's not looking, it's a safer thing to do than pluck your eye out, right? But the idea is don't be looking upon that sin. In verse 29, we see that Lot and his family, save one, are spared. It says, and it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. Then Lot was up in Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Oh, some of the ups and downs of what takes place when we allow sin to influence us and cause us to act. There are a lot of things that Lot lost, up to and including Lot lost his wife because of the decisions that, partially to the decisions that he made and partially to her own decision, but he helped to create that environment. He started out with a tent and with her. He gradually grows into having a home to live in where he can invite people in and does so. And so clearly he's doing okay for himself. It's recognized that where he is and what he's doing is not the right thing. And he goes from having that house to now where do we see that he has a dwelling? Now he's dwelling in a cave with his 2 daughters, right? I think the example is choosing to seek sin or follow after sin will cost you. I think that's something that we can glean from that. I think that we can take from that. And he lost a lot. God was still merciful, right? God still spared him. But there was still a price that was paid, wasn't there? There was a fairly large price to pay. And then I thought this was interesting. This is how we're going to close out the lesson. This we'll call Lot remembered. And the reason I say that is because this is in the second letter of Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, he's talked about the idea of Noah saving people from the flood and some other things. And picking up in verse 6, he says, in speaking of Lot, he says, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. You know, God says, you want to know what happens when you disobey me? Look back at the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah. You'll see what happens. But it says, and delivered righteous Lot. Look at the things that we talked about, some of the things that are done. And even in the upcoming text while they're in the cave and what happens with him and his daughters, and we're not going to get into that. But even with what takes place there, how is Lot remembered? It says, Lot, who was a delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. And you look at that, and that can create a lot of confusion, I think, for some people. And they're seeing that, but I think there's a message to what can happen if one of God's people, one who tries to live a righteous life and who is trying to live a righteous life, when we choose to put ourselves right into the middle of sin because that's where we choose to be, that it can and will torment our souls because we know what's right and we know what's wrong if we're honest. Right? And so we know even when we get involved in actions that we shouldn't be getting involved in actions, whether it's right or wrong. And if we're truly righteous, it does affect us, doesn't it? To the point at which we will feel guilty and we will try to follow God's way to get out of that. So there's a lot to pick up on. There are mistakes that were made in his life. Clearly, if he can be written about as a righteous man, he did things right along the way as well. I think we need to recognize that even the righteous can make their lives more difficult if they choose to. If we choose to, as the idea was, if we choose to pitch our tent toward Sodom on a regular basis, if we choose to decide to linger in those places. And what does linger mean? It means to stay too long. Should Lot have gone into Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeah, to teach them, right? Absolutely, we have to remember, he couldn't just sit back and say, oh, those are wicked people, so I just won't go there. But he set up his home amongst the wicked instead of near the positive influence. So there's a lot that we can take from this. I hope that this very brief study has at least got you thinking about some of the decisions that you make, or considering what can happen based on your choices, recognizing that a righteous person can still find themselves in difficult situations. God is a loving God. God can provide and will provide mercy for those who are righteous and those who seek it. And so there's a lot that goes into that. How would you be remembered today? If you passed on today, how would you be remembered? Would you be remembered as a righteous individual? Or would you be remembered as one who chose to live their life under the penalty and guilt of sin? No. If you've not been buried in the waters of baptism and risen again, then you're going to be remembered by those who are God's people as one who chose to live their life under the penalty of sin. And there will be sorrow when they think about you and when they think about the loss of you because of knowing where you will eternally end up. On the other hand, if you have been buried in the waters of baptism, if you are living a righteous life, then people will remember that, right? And you'll hear people use the term like, he's gone home. He's in a better place now. Those types of things. And you will be remembered for living a righteous life. You're going to have mistakes. You're going to make mistakes along the way. But if you correct those and if you stay in the light and you continue to strive to walk in the light and you ask for forgiveness, then what's going to happen is you're going to be remembered for being a righteous, not perfect, a righteous individual. But if you are making those mistakes and you want to be remembered as righteous, you have an opportunity simply to ask God to help you to do better and to forgive you in any sins that you may have committed. If there's anything that we as a congregation can help you to be remembered in the right way, let us know while we stand and while we sing.